Good morning, Dr. Rejman.
Morning.
We have your evidence today and tomorrow.
Thank you.
Now, you are talking to a select group of people here, representing both the public and lawyers for those who are involved in the inquiry as participants. But you're talking, although it may seem a small audience here, to a much larger audience out there online, and you may want to bear that in mind. They'll be watching you on YouTube or on live stream.
Thank you.
In a moment or two, Ms. Richards will ask you the questions, but first of all, Mary will invite you to take the oath.
Please state your full name.
Andrzej Stefan Mirosław Rejman.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Rejman, if at any time during my questions you can't hear me clearly, please do say so. You've provided 3 statements to the inquiry. I'm just going to give the references to those statements for the benefit of those following. Paul, there's no need to bring them up on the screen at this stage. Your first statement is WITN 4486001, and that in particular was concerned, I think, with what happened to documents relating to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Your second witness statement, WITN 4486025, is a response to the written statement and oral evidence of Mr. Jason Evans. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then your third witness statement, which deals with a whole range of matters relating to your work at the Department of Health, is WITN 4486040.
Yes, and that was in answer to the questions from the inquiry.
Yes. Now, I want to start, Dr. Rejman, by asking you a little about your career.
Yes.
You qualified as a doctor in around 1976, is that
That's
correct?
correct.
And you worked as a house officer and then a senior house officer in general medicine and surgery between 1976 and 1978.
Yes.
You began your hematology training in 1978, is that correct?
In 1978 to 79, I was on a pathology rotation, which basically means that over a 2-year period, you spend time in all of the pathology specialties. So it was not only hematology, but also clinical chemistry, microbiology, including virology, and histopathology or morbid anatomy.
And you eventually received your MRC path in 1986, is that
Yes.
right? In that intervening period, you worked, first of all, at St Thomas's from 1978 to October 1983 as a registrar and then senior registrar. What kind of clinical work were you undertaking there?
Right. Well, between 78 and 1980, as I said, I was doing this pathology rotation. And out of that pathology rotation, about 1 year and 3 months was hematology, because the way it operated was you'd spend 3 months in each of the specialties, and the specialty that you wanted to go for long term, you spend an extra year on out of the 2 years. And then after that, I had 6 months of doing a locum, and then I did 3 years of research, which was between St Thomas's Hospital and the Institute of Urology, and that was about the anemia of renal failure, and I got an MD as a result of that work.
So in that period of time, up until October 1983, to what extent were you undertaking clinical work?
Well, between 1980 and 1983, I was doing very little, well, between November 80 and November 83, I was doing very little clinical work because it was mainly laboratory work, basically taking samples from patients and going through quite a complicated set up, and the particular thing that I spent a lot of time on was high-performance liquid chromatography, which was looking at nucleotides of red cells which were raised in anemia of renal failure, and also I was looking at erythropoietin, and I think my studies were probably the last studies before recombinant erythropoietin came on board.
You then took up a post in late 1983 at Guy's Hospital.
That is correct.
Where you remained until, I think, July 1988. You were a senior registrar there.
Yes.
What did that entail?
Well, basically, that was a department which had a relatively small number of junior staff. I mean, so I think there were 2 senior registrars there, and at times we had a registrar, sometimes we had an SHO, but in essence it was a very busy clinical job with relatively few juniors, and it covered everything, sort of leukemia, myeloma, anemias, haemophilia. It had a small haemophilia unit, because after all it was only about a mile down the road from St Thomas's, which was a major centre. So I can't remember the number of haemophilia patients we had there, but it would have been a dozen or something like that.
Do you recall whether you ever prescribed factor 8 or factor 9 concentrates when you were at St Thomas's or Guy's?
Well, you mean prescribed or gave?
Well, took the decision to give, let me put it that way.
Well, at St Thomas's, because it was a much bigger unit and it had its own director and it had a sister who was committed to haemophilia, then a lot of the decision making was not being made by me. I would be there basically, you know, if there was an emergency in the middle of the night, I might have to make some sort of comment about somebody requiring factor 8, but to a large extent it wasn't me making that decision. At Guy's, it was a different setup because you had 2 staff nurses there who covered the whole of hematology. So, for example, leukemias, myelomas, and everything else they covered. They also were involved in the haemophilia, so they were the ones that would invariably be giving the treatment to the patient, because by that stage it was almost all concentrate, there was no cryo being used. Again, the first consultant that was in charge of haemophilia was Dr. Barkan, but then soon after I started there, he fell ill and was not able to work very much, and then he retired, and one of the other consultants took over the care of the haemophiliacs. So again, you know, in certain circumstances, I might have made a decision, yes, this person needs factor 8. A lot of the time, the actual factor 8 was given by a nurse rather than me, so that was it.
Did you have any experience when you were at Guy's of treating patients who had been infected with HIV in consequence of their treatment?
Well, at the time when I was there, I was aware that some of the patients had become infected. Now, at Guy's, treatment of HIV was not done in the hematology department. That was done by, I don't know, the infectious diseases department. And so we were not involved in that at all. The only thing obviously was that as soon as people were aware of HIV, then people were much, much more careful about wearing gloves and and getting, you know, making sure that needles, etc., were put in the right receptacles, etc., which, you know, in the late 70s probably wasn't done quite as thoroughly. I think that is probably the main thing, and none of the patients while I was there developed AIDS, because after it was quite early on in the thing, and I remember one child, who was probably about 10 or 12, who had, well, HCLV3 as it was at that time, and, you know, you just treated him like you would do normally, except, as I say, people were just that much more careful about handling blood and everything else.
And were you, during your time at Guy's, involved in the process of testing any of the patients for HTLV3 or communicating a positive test result to them?
I wasn't, well, I don't know. I mean, say, I was never aware myself of instigating the testing. Now, on occasion, if, for example, the consultant had decided that somebody needed to be tested, and if a form had to be filled in, do this test, then I might be asked to sign the form. But my recollection was that, to a large extent, it was not part of my role. Because I think what you have to recall is that at that time, with just 2 of us as senior registrars, with a lot of acute leukemics going through the thing, through the department, you know, you were so busy with that the haemophilia side of things was very, very low in the priority list because, you know, it was a small number of patients. Other people were looking after them. I think the staff nurses probably were the ones that were most involved in that sense, and the consultant that was looking after it. So in a sense, we weren't that involved in the management.
Now, you then had a locum position at the North Middlesex Hospital.
Yes.
A locum consultant, August 1988 to February 1989. What did that entail?
Well, basically, that at the North Middlesex, it had a high number of patients, particularly with thalassemia, because actually it's North London, and that's an area where you've got Cypriot community, both Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, which is one of the groups that have a high level of thalassemia. There were some sicklers as well, sickle cell patients as well. And there was also a lot of work there about lymphoma, etc. I cannot recall any haemophilia there at all.
Now, you then took up your position as Senior Medical Officer in the Department of Health, March 1989, through to December 1988, although we'll explore the latter part of what happened in terms of your work at the Department of Health shortly. During that time that you were Senior Medical Officer at the Department of Health, is it right to understand you also were an honorary consultant in haematology at St Thomas's?
Yes, and there I did a clinic, and it was the clinic run by Professor Tom Pearson. So that clinic was a mixture of polycythemia, other general haematology, and also sickle cell patients, because he was the person in charge of sickle cell at St Thomas's. So it was no haemophilia at all there.
And to what extent, how regular a time commitment was that clinic? Was that weekly?
It was weekly. I mean, say, basically it was a Friday morning. I'd go over to St Thomas's, do the clinic, and then in the afternoon I'd go back to DH, which obviously is very close.
And then when you left your role at the Department of Health, is it right to understand you had various consultancy posts, locum posts, posts in private hospitals?
Yes.
And then you took up a role at the Leicester Royal Infirmary in October 2004 as a consultant haematologist, where you remained until early 2011.
That's right. And the role that I did at the Leicester Royal Infirmary was I was responsible for general haematology. I had a specialist interest in myeloma. There was a consultant in charge of haemophilia. Occasionally, I might talk to her, and occasionally I might be at a meeting where they were discussing haemophilia, the general sort of, not management of haemophiliacs, but the management of the service, so to speak, particularly because I was at one stage head of service for haematology, so I had an overarching role there, because unlike St Thomas's, where the haemophilia unit was to a large extent separate from the rest of haematology, at the Leicester Royal Infirmary, the haemophilia unit was part of part of the overall haematology. So I had no involvement in treatment or management of patients as such there.
Now, just want to ask you next about your participation in litigation and inquiries. I'll come on to, in due course, your involvement in litigation during your employment at the Department of Health. So if we put that to one side. Your witness statement tells us that you have been, from time to time, an expert witness providing medical reports between 2006 and 2015.
Yes.
Did any of those cases, without going into the detail of any of them, involve issues falling within this inquiry's terms of reference?
I think there may have been one patient that I diagnosed as probably having von Willebrand's disease, and I'm not even sure whether we finally confirmed that. And I think, you know, she didn't need any treatment or anything like that. I think it was a case of coming up with a diagnosis for somebody, I think, who had heavy periods, and I think that was it. But apart from that, they were lymphomas, anemias, you know, any myelomas, anything and everything.
Were you ever asked to provide evidence to the Archer inquiry?
No.
In relation to the Penrose inquiry, well, I'll pick up in a moment the warning letter that you received from the Penrose inquiry and your response. But prior to receiving that letter, had you ever been approached by the Penrose inquiry in order to give written or oral evidence to them?
No.
Now, if we just then pick up WITN 4486043, please, Paul. So this, sorry, I'm just going to move my screen. This is a letter from the Penrose inquiry, 3rd of June 2014, and we can see it's said to be a warning letter in terms of the inquiry's Scotland Rules 2007. Was this, as far as you can recall, the first approach you had from the Penrose inquiry?
Yes, I think originally the first letter came to me at home, and so I contacted what was then TSOL, which is now the GLD, for advice, and they said yes, that they had actually been involved with other people, and so basically I discussed with them and I prepared my statement with them.
And we can see, if we pick it up in the second paragraph of the letter, it's an issue that we'll be coming back to in more detail later in your evidence, but it concerned delay in introducing screening of donated blood for hepatitis C and the decision-making of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And the letter explains your name was mentioned on a number of occasions, as the report contains criticism of the time taken for ACVSB to recommend the introduction of screening. It's possible that the text could be construed as impliedly critical of you, although you're not criticised expressly. And you were invited to respond if you wanted to.
Yes.
And then we can see your response if we go to WITN 4486044. This is the covering letter from TSOL. Can I just ask you about the third paragraph? It says Dr. Rejman's response makes reference to a list of documents in his possession in June 1995, which he prepared as a part of a discovery exercise for HCV litigation at that time, and then it refers to you having left the Department of Health and not having the documents themselves. What was this list, and why did you still have it?
Well, basically, that was the list, which actually I can't remember where it appears. It's in my... it's in the first statement, because that was the list that I prepared when I found out about the missing volume 4. So basically, it is that listing which, basically, I can't remember whether I think actually I had it in hard copy, because, you know, I just happened to have it at home. You know, the way that you don't throw everything away. I just happened to have it at home, and that is the list that is in the 7th of June 1995, I wrote to Anita James to say, here is the list 1989 to 1991, and that was the list. And that list we offered to the Penrose Inquiry in case they wanted it. I obviously didn't have the documents, but it was actually the listing of the documents.
And did they ask to see the list?
They did not.
And we'll pick up the issue about those documents and what
Later
happened
on,
to
yeah.
them and your dealings with Ms James, I think during the course of your evidence tomorrow. If we just go over the page then, again, we'll come back to, in much more detail, to the decision-making regarding hepatitis C screening of blood. But if we just pick it up at the bottom half of this page, the ACVSB and my role in the Secretariat, you say the draft report appears to suggest I had much more influence on the decisions of the ACVSB than was in fact the case. And then you explain how it worked in practice. You say you were not a member of the committee, you didn't have a vote, and you took no part in the decision-making process of the committee. And you explain your role was to facilitate discussions by preparing and circulating papers in advance of meetings, by summarising topics for discussion. You say your knowledge about hepatitis C prior to your time on ACVSB was limited to knowing that it occurred in haemophiliacs whom you treated in the past. And you say you were not an expert. You presented the facts to the best of your ability in an objective manner so the expert members of the committee could discuss the topic, etc.
Right, could I just butt
Yes,
in there for a second?
please do.
The person that made the criticism of me at the Penrose Inquiry was Professor Laikala from Finland. Now, I knew Professor Laikala because when I was on the SPHM of the Council of Europe, both the main committee and the Bureau, which was a subcommittee of the main committee, he was in those two committees and at one stage was the chairman of those committees. Now, when I was at those committees, I was a full member and therefore equal to him, and therefore, well, we didn't have votes in those days, but basically I was a full member. And I do not know whether Professor Laikala, when he made the comments about me, did not understand that my role in the ACVSB was completely different. Because as you know, in committees, and I have been in different roles in committees, I've been a chairman of a committee, I've been a full member of a committee, I've been an observer on a committee, and I've been a medical secretary of a committee. 4 totally different roles. And depending upon what your role is, determines what influence you have over the decision making by that committee. Thank you.
No, we'll come back either later today or tomorrow to the actual decision-making process of the ACVSB and look at your role in more detail. But is the description that you set out in paragraph 4 of this statement to the Penrose Inquiry, is that your evidence to this inquiry in a nutshell, that that was your role?
Yes, yes.
Right, well, as I say, we'll unpick that in more detail when we look at some of the underlying documents tomorrow. And then just to complete your exchanges with the Penrose Inquiry, if we go to WITN 4486045, we can see that you asked TSOL to forward a letter to the Penrose Inquiry, and if we go over the page, you say in the second paragraph, you refer to the warning letter, and then you say, I'm disappointed that the final report does not appear to have taken into account the representations I've made, and feel that the findings therefore do not present a balanced account of my role on the ACVSB. And then you refer again to not being a member and being a member of the committee, being a member of the Secretariat. And then you say this, please also kindly note that in the event the final report is used in future litigation, I will, if necessary, refer to and expand upon my representations to the inquiry. Why did you want to write this letter to the Penrose Inquiry, Dr. Rejman?
Because I was very disappointed with their response to my letter. TSOL and I had spent, I can't remember, it wasn't as long obviously as we're doing in this inquiry, but we'd spent, I know, a month and a half preparing a detailed response to the comments because it was the draft report that I'd been sent extracts of, and Penrose just ignored it. It was as though I hadn't sent it.
What did you mean by the reference to in the event that the final report is used in future litigation? What kind of litigation did you think?
Well, I don't know. You see, I think there's always the possibility that if in an inquiry somebody picks up something from the inquiry, then they may decide, oh, well, this is something we can sue him or we can tie him into litigation with others type of thing. And so I was basically saying that, you know, you have ignored it, I'm retaining it, and if it appears somewhere in the future, you know, I have actually told you that that is what has happened.
And then for the sake of completeness, I don't think we need to look at it, but it's right to note that Penrose Inquiry wrote back and said that the inquiry had received your detailed response and the chairman had given your representations careful consideration. But we're not an inquiry into the Penrose Inquiry, so I'm not going to go and ask you any more about that. You also tell us in your statements to this inquiry that you provided a witness statement for the Department of Health and Social Care in a judicial review recently.
Yes.
Again, I'm not asking you about the details of the individual case, but what in broad terms was the nature of the evidence that you provided?
In essence, it was about the history of the introduction of hepatitis B screening in the blood transfusion service.
Would it be right to understand that most of that had occurred prior to you taking up your role at the department?
Oh, yes, this was early 70s onwards, you know.
Now, I want to come now to your role and responsibilities as a senior medical officer in the Department of Health. You told us in your statement that having started in March 1989, you ceased employment in December 1988. But is it right to understand that between August 1997 and December 1998, you were working less than full-time for the department?
I was, well, I think there is at some stage there, I've made a comment that in August, well, between August and October 1997, I was on occasion asked by colleagues, former colleagues from the Department of Health, to make comments on bits and pieces about the HCV litigation that at that stage was being discussed. And I did this because the person that took over my role covering hematology, Dr. Mike McGovern, who, as I mentioned, is no longer with us, he had never been involved in that. And therefore, it was really a case of giving him a chance to get on, catch up, so to speak. And I was really just helping them with odd minutes here or there. But apart from that, after the end of August, after the end of July 1997, I was no longer involved in hematology, including haemophilia and blood transfusion at the Department of Health. And then after that, I spent some time on gardening leave. Then I spent some time doing work as a locum consultant.
Now, what in broad terms, before we look at any of the actual documents relating to your job, but what in broad terms did the job of senior medical officer entail for you?
Well, my understanding was that my job was to be a person who provides advice to administrators, to senior medical people within the department, and most of the time they would be the ones that would pass information on to ministers. I cannot recall an occasion when we had a ministerial meeting where I was in the lead. You know, it was always administrators that were very much in the lead, or possibly a senior medical person like the DCMO or the CMO. And in essence, also, when I went to various other bodies, I was a conduit for information between those bodies, such as the UK HCDO and the department. So I'd go to their meetings, I'd listen, I'd tell them if there was anything that they needed to know from the department's point of view, and then if they had something that the department needed to know, I would pass that on. So in a sense, I was basically a functionary. You know, that was my role within the department.
And if we just look at what I think was a job description, it's at WITN 4486042, please, Paul. I think technically it's a vacancy statement, so it describes the job that people were being invited to apply for. And it says your duties will include A, providing medical advice on all aspects of haematology. And if we just go down the page a little further, we can see that the fifth subparagraph there is provision of advice to administrative and senior colleagues on haematology matters. And then B, taking over the principal medical officer's responsibilities for haemophilia. What in practice did that mean?
Well, I think in essence that meant that I was going to be the DH observer at the UKHCDO meetings.
And then deputising for the principal medical officer in giving advice on blood transfusion and the CBLA. And then, if we just...
Sorry,
yes.
could I just butt in there?
Of course.
I had, as I mentioned in my statements, I had a relatively minor role when it came to the CBLA, because even though the principal medical, it says there that I would take over the PMO's responsibilities, she did not relinquish them, or at least not the first PMO I had was Dr. Hilary Pickles, and she was involved. Subsequent PMOs, I don't think were interested, to be honest.
So would it be right to understand that you were the only medical officer with a haematology brief, and you reported to the principal medical officer who had and we'll hear from Dr. Pickles on Thursday, who had a wider brief which included haematology, but it was pathology generally? Yes,
my understanding is that there had previously been an SMO in haematology, but then I think for a period of about a year, there was nobody in the post. Now, the interesting thing with this job description and job advertisement was it was not a general advert for an SMO in the department. It was a specific advert for an SMO, and they actually said in the BMJ slip advert that they wanted somebody with haematology experience, preferably with MRC path. So this was different from the vast majority of other posts within the Department of Health, which I think Diana Wolf had said, you know, people came in and did any old job. And it was the fact that they were a medic and had that basic medical training that was the reason why they were appointed as SMO, whereas in this particular case, they actually wanted a haematologist.
And maybe this is a question for Dr. Pickles, but do you know why the department had taken the decision that rather than simply filling the SMO post, they specifically wanted an SMO with haematology experience?
You would have to ask her that.
Now, what, if any, training did you receive on taking up your role as SMO?
Zero.
So was it very much a question of being, as I think we've heard from a couple of other witnesses, thrown in at the deep end and expected to get on with the job?
Well, basically, I think in the department, I think you have to remember that people were friendly to each other. There was, generally speaking, no backstabbing. You came into the role, I came in there, Dr. Pickles came in there, she welcomed me, she gave me an idea, well, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to do, this is not what you need to do. If you have any problems, my door is there, knock on the door. And in a sense, you know, I took it as it was, and I think, you know, people were helpful. You know, I wanted to know something, I could ask them, you know, whether they were a medic or an administrator, you know, people were helpful.
Now, in terms of the medical hierarchy to which you belonged when you started at the Department of Health, is it right to understand that you reported to the principal medical officer, who was Dr. Pickles for the
Yes.
first part of your time at the Department of Health. And then above the principal medical officer, who would have been next?
There would have been a senior principal medical officer. And then above him would be the deputy chief medical officer. And finally, it'd be the CMO. And obviously the numbers in each of the grades were smaller and smaller and smaller, so that you had only one CMO. And I think when I was at DH, there was a time when I think there were 3 DCMOs, but then they dropped to 2. And the SPMOs, I don't know, there might have been, I know, 8 or 10 or something like that. So, and PMOs there were more of.
And is it right to understand that the DCMO, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, with whom you had the most dealings was Dr. Metters?
Yes, because Dr. Harris, I think, was the DCMO for, I think, the first 2 or 3 meetings of the ACVSB, but then he retired. And Dr. Metters, who I think had been an SPMO, was promoted to DCMO, and he then took over that role.
And can you recall what Dr. Metters' area of clinical expertise was?
He was a gynecologist.
Now, that's the medical hierarchy then, and we've heard from other witnesses there was, at this point in time, a parallel administrative hierarchy. Now, I know you set out a number of the individuals with whom you dealt in your statement. Is it right to understand that the administrative colleague with whom you would deal might depend upon what the subject matter was? So, for example, with the haemophilia litigation, I think you mostly dealt with Mr. Canavan. Is that right?
Yes, I think the way it operated was that there was a parallel hierarchy, but on the other hand, grades were a little bit different. So, for example, as an SMO, I was a grade 5. Now, in the parallel administrative hierarchy, the grade 5 was the assistant secretary. But there was a difference in our importance within the department, in the sense that an assistant secretary could sign documents on behalf of the Secretary of State, which was nothing that I would ever be asked to do. So he was a bit above me in that sense, but on the other hand, on the same grade. So it's all sort of a bit of a mess. But the person I had most contact with, as you say, was the principal, which is a grade 7, which was John Canavan, and then later on it was Tom Kelly, then Paul Pudlow, and then Chris Corrigan. So that was where most of my contacts were, but obviously John Canavan answered to the Assistant Secretary, and depending upon the particular, not only the subject, but on the particular thing that we're discussing at that moment, then it might be more appropriate for me to be dealing with the Assistant Secretary rather than John Canavan. And if you look at the minutes, they're a mixture of the AS writing to me, or me writing to the AS, or me writing to John Canavan, or him writing, you know, so it's all a bit of a mixture. And I think it worked pretty well. I don't think anybody got at all uptight saying, oh, well, you should have actually really spoken to me first, type of thing. Because I think, as I say, people worked together. You know, we were, even though I was a medic, they were the administrators, we were forever in each other's offices. And, you know, it wasn't even a case of, okay, you pick up the phone if you want to, but on the other hand, quite often just go to the office, speak face to face. So I think it was to my mind, it worked extremely well. So that was why I was so disappointed with the Evans report, which we'll go into later on, that she seemed to imply that there was this total barrier between the two, and to my mind, never existed.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Rejman, and maybe now is a convenient moment to do so, what you saw the advantages and disadvantages of this parallel system of medical, a medical team and an administrative team, as opposed to a more fully integrated team.
Well, to my mind, the real difference was that when we had the parallel hierarchies, I had you know, if I had a medical problem or something which was about medical matters, I could go to the PMO, go to the SPMO, obviously with the ACSB go to the DCMO, and I knew exactly where I stood. They knew me, everybody knew everything that was going on. With the parallel hierarchy, you had the system whereby my line manager stopped being the PMO, it was the assistant secretary. And that assistant secretary, okay, when we were talking about general administrative matters, fine, no problem. But if it was anything sort of medical, there was this difficulty. And as I mentioned in my statement, if I wanted to speak to medics, I had to go outside my branch or whatever division even to go to somebody else. And that was much more difficult because they might be they would not know as much about hematology or hematology matters as I did, whereas my PMO would have actually picked something up as they went along by virtue of all the stuff coming through to them. And so I was not in favour of the merger at all.
I'll pick up on some of those and how it changed in a few minutes. But before we do that, you've referred to...
Can I just interrupt there? What you said, I think, and I just want to check that you actually meant to say this, was that with the parallel hierarchy, that's where you have the separate medical and administrative hierarchies, whereby my line manager stopped being the PMO, it was the assistant secretary. And that assistant secretary, when we talk about general administrative matters, no problem, but it wasn't anything medical. That was the parallel hierarchy you were talking about.
Yes, because basically, parallel hierarchy, my line management was medical all the way up to CMO.
Yes.
Under the merged thing, it was potluck who your line manager was.
So you were reporting to people who knew nothing much about your area of expertise?
That is correct, and I think actually in my report, I did actually say initially, right at the beginning when Banks was actually introduced, I was actually put into a branch where only 12, well, I had SLAs, that means these service level agreements, for most of my work, and only 12% of my work actually related to that branch.
Yes. Yes, and you were being assessed.
Well, that was one
appraised.
of the difficulties because you see, within the Department of Health, you had annual appraisals, and doing an annual appraisal, having an administrator doing an annual appraisal who doesn't fully understand your work and how much work you've put in and how important, it was always a bit difficult. Whereas with the PMO, they knew exactly where I was and it was an easier setup.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned a few minutes ago that in terms of meetings with ministers, you can't recall any examples where you took the lead in a meeting. Can you recall any meetings that you attended with the Secretary of State for Health, whether it was Kenneth Clarke or William Waldegrave, to discuss the HIV litigation? Were you present at such meetings?
You'd have to look in the minutes. It is quite likely that I did, but the point really was that I honestly can't remember. You'd have to look in the minutes. It is quite possible that I was there, but if I were there, I would very much be, very low down the scale, because if Secretary of State were discussing something like that, the important people for him would be the Permanent Secretary, possibly the CMO, and also the Deputy Secretaries who had the most day-to-day experience of what was going on, and solicitors, and I would be a sort of an add-on.
So is it right to understand you may have attended such meetings, but you have no recollection of any particular meeting? You had some recollection, your statement told us, of having meetings with Thomas Sackville.
Yes.
Who was a minister, I can't remember the precise years, but at some point in the course of the 1990s. Would that have been, do you think, in relation to the campaign for compensation for haemophiliacs infected with hepatitis C?
Well, that would have been one of the things. I think the thing is, I remember him, because, you know, I can't remember why it was, but for some reason, he's a figure that stood out for me. It may have been that I had more meetings with him. I might have had half a dozen with him, whereas with others, I might have had one or two. But, I mean, so I recall him just for that reason, I think.
So you don't recall the content of any particular meeting with Mr. Sackville?
I don't really know, sorry.
Um,
Oh, sorry. One of the reasons why we might have met with Tom Sackville and other ministers was if there were an adjournment debate in the House. Now, the administrators would provide briefing for that adjournment debate, and in fact, with the administrators and I would actually attend the adjournment debate, and we would actually be in the House so that we could actually slip notes to the minister if there was some information he required which wasn't in the briefing that we'd provided. So I do remember going to the House on a number of occasions for adjournment debates.
Now, what, as far as you can tell us, was the yardstick or the criteria for a decision to bring something to the attention of the minister?
That would not have been my decision remotely. That was a purely, well, I don't know, CMO might have had a view, or even DCMO might have had a view. That would have been a decision for my administrative colleagues, because they were much more aware of political niceties. In fact, they'd actually been there longer than I had. This is one of the things you have to recall, that even at the end, even when just before I left, okay, I'd had 8 years there. By that stage, I was actually much more aware. But definitely at the beginning, I really had no idea who did what and what was thing. And I think the administrators were the ones that really had more of a nose for it, and their antennae were much more attuned to that than mine, because as far as I was concerned, my job was, you want to have some information about something, I'll go and either give it to you straight out, or I'll hunt it up for you and provide it to you. That's my job. That is primarily my job. The business about whether a minister is going to say something or whatever, really.
I appreciate, Dr. Rejman, it wasn't your decision as to whether something needs to go to the minister or not, but did you over the years develop a feel for, or a sense of, what might be the trigger points for something needing to go to the minister? For example, when we look at the ACVSB meetings, we'll see from time to time Dr. Metters saying this will need to be reported to the minister, or the minister will need to be kept informed. Were there any particular issues that you became aware of? Spending, publicity, public safety, litigation, anything you can recall?
Well, not really, because to my mind, others were dealing with that. And if you've gone through my papers, you can see I was busy. I did actually churn out a lot of stuff. And if you're doing that, you know, you're hardly going to spend your time thinking, oh, well, perhaps somebody might want to know this or that. And it was obviously Dr. Metters, as chairman of that committee, it was his role to make decisions about, well, this is something we need to send to ministers. And obviously, he was much higher up the hierarchy, and therefore, he would be much more attuned to what ministers would want to know and what they should know. Not only what they wanted to know, but what they should know. Whereas from my point of view, it just didn't come into my reckoning at all. I mean, say, you know, if John Canavan said, I will send this to the minister, and he said to me, would you like to sort of provide some background briefing? Not a problem. But I wouldn't make the decision about it going to minister at all.
Now, in terms of the chief medical officer, as I understand it from your statement, you had relatively few dealings with the chief medical officer.
Yes, I mean, say, the number of meetings was very small indeed, because in a sense, The DCMO was the person that I had much more dealings with. CMO, as I said, occasionally there might be something where we had a meeting with CMO and I might be there as one of a group. I don't think my meetings with CMO one-to-one, I couldn't think of a reason why that should happen. Because at my grade and at my level and with my particular expertise and my contributions, they were for others and then it all funneled up, so to speak.
In going back then to the parallel administrative and medical teams, was there any practice or rule of thumb as to who might initiate discussions about policy? Was that for the administrative team or was the medical team free to make policy suggestions?
I think policy suggestions primarily came from the admin team. Now, it might be that people like the DCMO and the CMO might think about policy decisions, but primarily a policy. Now, you see, for example, if you talk about, decision about introducing HCV screening. Now, okay, Dr. Metters was in charge of the committee which actually had the job of deciding about the screening and recommended it. So obviously he was aware of that, and therefore he would presumably have told his opposite number, the DSs, although I didn't see any particular minutes about this happening, but I presume you see, because the thing is, it's a case of whom you chat to, and whom you have close contact with. And he obviously would discuss it with CMO, and therefore they might then say, oh, well, this is a policy. But basically, they would still defer to the administrators, because if you look at the submission, it came from John Canavan. In fact, I'm surprised it came from him and not from the AS, because normally an important item like that, I would have expected the AS to do it, and I don't know whether it was a case of the ASs might have changed at that. See, that was the point. You see, John Canavan was there for a lot of the time that I was in post, so he was there for several years, but the ASs seemed to change sort of every couple of years, so, I don't know what happened then.
Now, as you've already alluded to, that parallel system changed. You referred to the bank's report.
Yes.
Can you just outline for us briefly what that was and the changes that it led to?
Well, I mean, I don't think that I ever read the bank's report in its entirety, either at the time or even more recently. But in essence, the bank's report was looking at the way that the Department of Health operated, and from the bits that I've extracted in my statements, basically the bank's decision was that that the parallel hierarchy should be scrapped and that everything should be merged. And I think she thought this was going to be more efficient, everybody was going to be happy, and the world would be a better place. I think the thing is, some people may well have thought that, some of us did not.
Can I ask you to look at WITN 4486002, which is an extract from the Bsc Inquiry Report that you've appended to your witness statement. If we go to page 10, please, Paul. You'll see the heading, Dr. Rejman, Department of Health, and I just want to pick up at paragraph 4.47 and ask whether this reflected your experience. So Dr. Ailsa White,
yes.
At that stage an SMO, said that even before the 1995 merger, she worked very closely with her administrative colleagues as part of a team, and that administrators generally prepared briefings or submissions for ministers with the assistance of medical staff. An administrative colleague confirmed this, adding that on work with a high medical or scientific content, the professionals would take the lead, with administrators providing assistance, while issues that had a high administrative or political content would remain within the purview of the latter, consulting closely with the specialists where required. Now, that's not your evidence, it's the evidence of those with a different area of speciality in terms of the medical office at the time. But does that reflect broadly your experience, that description?
Yes, I mean, say, you know, it's a case of what you call a team, because a team can be across two groups, two branches even. Just because, you know, I mean, say, and I would very much agree with that I worked very closely with my administrative colleagues, and that they did prepare the briefings or submissions for ministers, and that if something were highly medical, then I would take the lead as far as it went, because obviously once that transferred into a briefing or a submission, I was no longer taking the lead.
And then, can I ask you to look at another extract from the Bsc Inquiry Report? It's at MHRA 0031996, please, Paul. And if we just go to page 15, there's just one passage I want to ask you about, again, really just hopefully as a shortcut to describing roles. So paragraph 213, bottom half of the page, says officials had 3 roles. The first was to alert and advise, i.e. to identify and consider issues on the basis of appropriate information, to identify options for addressing them, and to present the information and recommendations to ministers. This was mainly done by a relatively small number of policy staff in each department. The second was to assist in carrying out ministers' decisions, a role that involved policy planning and problem solving. The third was to manage and deliver services for which the government was responsible. Now, that's obviously looking at a different subject matter from the areas with which you were concerned. But those 3 roles, did your role or did your job cover those 3 roles, or was there one element of that more than another that predominated?
Right, okay. The first part of that role, no, I wasn't involved in that, to alert or advise ministers. The second, carrying out ministers' decisions, no. And the third, I wasn't involved in managing or delivering services.
So that wouldn't cover
None of that would have related to me.
Can I then, just still dealing with your work in general, I'll ask you about dealings with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Did you have any sort of regular interaction with colleagues, whether medical or administrative, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in their respective health departments or offices?
Not a regular thing. I mean, say, I met them at meetings of the ACVSB and MSBT. If there were a particular specific subject, then I might meet them at a meeting to discuss that. And I can't remember. I remember on one occasion seeing Dr. Keel from SHHD at a meeting. I can't for the life of me remember what the topic was, but if there was a particular topic that, I don't know, they happen to have a particular interest in or whatever, but in essence, the contacts with the other the other countries' departments were primarily administrators.
Was it your understanding that medical officers within the relevant departments for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland would be providing separate advice, distinct from the advice that you and your colleagues would be providing to the Department of Health in London?
Well, this was a time before devolution, obviously, when Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland was still, didn't have separate governments. And the impression I gained was that their departments were smaller than DH by a significant margin. And so the relevant doctors in their departments would have had a much wider role. So, for example, there would not have been an SMO dealing just with haematology. You know, they'd be dealing with haematology and other matters as well. And because of that, I think they did to a certain extent rely upon work done within DH, and particularly a lot of the policy decisions would come from DH. Now, obviously, they would discuss them with the territorials, but ultimately, I think DH was the bigger department and where they went for, because they, I mean, say, to be frank, I mean, say, they couldn't possibly, you know, to have that number of people working in SHHD with a population of 5 million, whereas the rest of it, we had whatever, it was 50 odd million, you couldn't justify it remotely.
Were there any systems or measures in place to for information sharing between the 4 departments?
I think there was, but again, it would have been mainly on the admin side. I mean, say, when I have gone through the various papers for my statements, there obviously were occasions when I wrote individually to Dr. Keel, and that was about the Look Back Working Party. There is actually a fax that I sent to her, as well as to Angela Robinson. That's sort of a one-off because there was a particular item that it was important for her to know, and particularly in that case because the SHHD had been so very much involved in the decision to go for Look Back, because after all it was they that had done the pilot that had shown that Look Back was feasible, and they were the ones that had said, look, it's feasible, we should really do this. And if you read the minutes from John Canavan and others, they were worried that Scotland could go alone ahead of the rest of the UK, and so it was so important that they should be kept within the group. And so that, I think, probably was the reason why I sent that fax to her, because of those sensitivities. Sorry.
But would it be right to understand from what you've said, though, that there was no particular system or process in place to share medical advice between the 4 departments?
Well, not really, because I think the thing is, the ACVSB, which to a large extent was a major part of my role, that obviously went to them. They came along, they were observers. Sometimes a lot of the time they didn't say very much. Occasionally they did say something, and they had the Scottish transfusion director, I think it was Ruther Mitchell initially, who represented Scotland. So they got all that information. A lot of the other work I did, well, you know, NEQAS, for example, the quality assurance system for laboratories, well, that was a UK-wide thing, and they presumably got information from their laboratories, so I'm not sure that my attending a NEQAS meeting, there'd be any reason for me to tell them.
Now, we've mentioned the ACVSB, which
yes.
we'll look at in more detail, and you were involved as Medical Secretary to that committee and to its successor committee,
yes.
the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissues. You've listed in your statement a range of other committees,
yes.
working groups and so on that you had
yes.
different forms of involvement with. I'm not going to go through those, but for anyone who wants to follow, they're listed in Dr. Rejman's 3rd statement in response to questions 10 and 11, but I'm not going to take up time looking at those now. I want to ask you next, Dr. Rejman, really to cast your mind back to March 1989 when you joined the Department of Health, and assist us in understanding what you knew at that time about AIDS and non-A, non-B hepatitis, hepatitis C. You say in your statement your knowledge was that of a general haematologist and not a specialist in transfusion or haemophilia.
Yes.
What what do you recall knowing, first of all, about AIDS and HIV and its transmission through blood and blood products?
Well, in essence, AIDS became common knowledge at the time when I started doing my research job. And my research job was very busy. I mean, say there were days when I'd be in the laboratory literally analysing samples for 36 hours on the trot with no, you know, obviously having coffee and having lunch, etc., but not going home at all. You know, carrying on, putting in more samples, more samples, more samples. So it was an extremely busy job. So I really had no time at that time to consider much of what was going on. But obviously, anybody reading the newspapers or reading the Lancet or the BMJ would have been aware of the reports in the MMWR. So I was aware in general terms of what the public knew, but more than that, what a medical interpretation of what the public knew. But it wasn't as though I was reading all sorts of other reports, and I wouldn't have bothered going to the initial reports. I'd read what it said in the Lancet or in the BMJ, and I'd make a note and say, oh, well, this is quite interesting, and that is it. So it really had no impact on me at all. Then when I started working at Guy's, which would have been in late 83, at that stage, that was when the first suggestions about it possibly being transmitted by blood and the first reports of haemophiliacs being infected. And obviously, again, because the haemophilia unit there was so small, it wasn't really a major issue, because most of my time was dealing with acute leukemics, which were dying in front of us if we didn't treat them. And even if we treated them, they were still dying in front of us. So, it's a case of where do you put your thoughts and your work? And the work basically was trying to keep these acute leukemics alive, and also the myelomas and everybody else. And the haemophiliacs were people that, would pitch up. I can't remember, to tell you the truth, I can't even remember what proportion of them were on home treatment. But, you'd occasionally see a haemophiliac that pitched up who needed treatment, and, they'd be seen by the staff nurse, and she'd ask, oh, well, should we give him some factor VIII, which they knew that the answer was yes, because they'd actually prepared it, was ready to give him, and he'd say, yes, that's fine. And you'd have a quick word with the haemophiliac and just generally say, how are you, how are things generally, and that would be it. So I think my sort of involvement and knowledge of AIDS, obviously as more and more became available and as more and more was in the Lancet and the BMJ, and also later on when I started subscribing to the when I joined the British Society of Hematology, and when I got the BMJ, when I got the British Journal of Hematology, then obviously I got more and more knowledge, but it was very much sort of a general hematologist's knowledge, and even there, not somebody that was interested particularly in blood transfusion or in haemophilia.
Now, in terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which by the time you joined the Department of Health, the identification of hepatitis C had taken place. What do you recall your knowledge and understanding about that form of hepatitis was as at March 89?
Well, I think all of us as haematologists, and particularly I did 3 months at the blood transfusion centre in Tooting, obviously we were aware of hepatitis following transfusion, and it was obviously something that we were aware of. I think the main form of hepatitis we were aware of initially, even as students, was hepatitis B, because that was the thing that had killed people in Edinburgh and in other parts of the country, particularly in haemodialysis units. And Therefore, after that, we had the Rosenheim report and other things which addressed hepatitis B, and then you had hepatitis B screening became available. So that was the focus of hepatitis initially. Later on, people realized that despite screening for hepatitis B, there was still some hepatitis following blood transfusions. And so it was a general knowledge, well, it's there, and there's nothing we can do very much about it. Also, in haemophiliacs, we were aware of it, because I think I mentioned in my statement, there was one particular instance. I can't remember the person remotely, but I just remember it as an incident. And this was when, on a particular day when this would have been after 79, because this is when Jeff Savage was at Thomas's after Professor Ingram had retired. Jeff Savage was at home on the given day, and the sister in haemophilia, who was the one basically who ran the shop to a large extent, you know, she decided people needed treatment, she gave them the treatment and everything else. She called me in and said, look, we've got this patient who's gone yellow and he's had some factor VIII recently. So I rang up Jeff Savage at home and said to him, you know, what do I do about this? And he basically said to me, well, get them to make a note of the batch number of the factor VIII he's had recently, and get them to send the whole of that batch back to the manufacturer, ask them to send a replacement batch, which is what I did. And I wasn't involved in all of that because that was the chief MLSO was involved in getting supplies and sending supplies backwards and forwards. And that was the end of it as far as I was concerned. But to my mind, it just focused on my mind. This was somebody that had gone yellow having had factor VIII. And that was it.
Now, can we just look at your witness statement, please, Dr. Rejman? It's your third statement, WITN 4486040. And if we could go to page 64. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's not the right page, I think. I've got this in with different pagination. If you go back onto that, Paul, I'll work it out. If we go to the next page, please. That's it. So you describe the incident in paragraph 44.7 that you just told us about. I'm not going to ask you again about that. But if we go to the bottom of the page, we have paragraph 44.8, where you say this: the perception that a significant proportion of patients infected by non-A, non-B could progress to a more serious disease became more widely accepted in the mid, and the top of the next page, 1980s, and particularly by 1989, as stated in the Penrose Inquiry final report. And then you refer to that was when you were working in the busy, understaffed haematology department at Guy's with only a small number of haemophiliacs, and you couldn't recall any having significant liver disease. Now, what's the factual basis for your assertion there that the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis became more widely accepted in the mid-1980s? Is that looking at the Penrose report, or was that based on your own knowledge?
Well, basically looking at the Penrose report, and also obviously, you see, I think the thing is, one has to sort of look back and see what was I doing at the various times. And as I have explained, because it was not a major factor in the work that I was doing, I mean, say, I may have come across it in the BMJ or Lancet or wherever, or in the British Journal of Hematology, but it would have been one of those things that you look at and you say, well, that's interesting, and carry on. And that is it, So it is not as though suddenly in 89 or something, it was the sort of, Damascene, struck dumb and said, oh, this is so fantastic to know this. It was just sort of gradual information that was coming through the system, which I presumably became aware of but I didn't focus on because it was only when I started working in the department when obviously there we were specifically discussing, non-A, non-B, etc., that obviously I started focusing on it. Prior to that, there was no reason to focus on it.
So if we then come on to when you joined the department in March of 1989, do you have any recollection of what the collective understanding within the department was, or within the medical hierarchy was, of non-A, non-B hepatitis C and its seriousness?
Well, it's difficult to know because obviously with ACVSB, obviously the people involved with that were aware of it. Obviously we had one of the SMOs, and I can't remember who it was initially, later on it was Dr. Hugh Nicholas, but whoever was the SMO who had responsibility for hepatitis, that person would obviously be the person in the department who would know most about it. And there was also the person involved in the treatment of hepatitis and liver disease, who was a different person. So you had sort of three different strands. You had me looking at it from the blood transfusion, haemophilia side of it. You had the hepatitis, liver disease generally knowledge person, and the treatment person. So you had three different people that were involved in it. And obviously all of those would answer to their individual seniors, and it would all go presumably back up through to the DCMO, which is Dr. Harrison and Dr. Metters.
So would it be right to understand that if we're looking at the spring of 1989, you came into the role with no particular knowledge about non-A, non-B hepatitis other than what you'd picked up from general medical literature?
Yes.
Would it be right to understand that you essentially learnt on the job, in particular through your work with the ACVSB, more about that particular virus?
Very much so. I mean, say, it was for me, it was a topic that obviously there was, I'd changed from a situation where my knowledge was based on 3 publications, to a situation where there are all sorts of other publications that I was seeing, and obviously with the experts, with Professor Zuckerman and Professor Tedder and Dr. Mortimer and the others, there was a lot of information coming, and then I was trying very hard to bring it together. And my function on the ACVSB primarily was to try and bring this information together, and obviously advised by the experts, primarily the ones that I've just mentioned, to actually try and get the information so that the committee could look at it. Now, obviously, the person in charge of liver disease, etc., would obviously quite often would be copied in on this, and sometimes might even attend an ACVSB meeting if they had anything particular to contribute. But I got the impression that, in a sense, when it came to blood and blood products, the ACVSB was the centre of all knowledge, put it like that.
And then last question before we break, Dr. Rejman, if we can go back to your witness statement, so WITN 4486040. Let's try page 67, Paul. Yes, that's the one. Paragraph 47.2, you say general information to ministers about the serious nature of non-A, non-B/HCV was given as appropriate by individuals within the DH who had a specific responsibility for hepatitis. My administrative colleagues and I would pass on information relating to blood and blood products. Now, in relation to that first sentence, is it right to understand that that's an assumption on your part? Is it? Or do you know as a fact that ministers were given information about the seriousness of non-A, non-B by those who had specific responsibility for hepatitis?
Well, that is an assumption, but it's based on the practicalities. And the practicalities are that if the as the knowledge about the seriousness of non-A, non-B progressed, then the person who had responsibility for hepatitis, he or she would have been very much on the ball. They would know about it. They would then presumably pass it on to their seniors. Their seniors would then discuss it with administrators and others, and they would say, look, you know, this is important that ministers know this. Now, it might not be as a submission, but it might be, you know, they pass it on to the Bsc or whoever, that next time when you're seeing the minister, perhaps you could mention this and just give him some briefing. You know, not necessarily a proper submission, but they might actually brief him and say, look, you know, things are changing in hepatitis. You know, what we thought was pretty mild is actually much more severe. And to my mind, that would have been a very likely scenario, because otherwise, if we sent them submissions about non-A, non-B, then the minister would come back to us and say, but we've never heard of this. And we never had that sort of response from ministers saying, look, we've never ever heard of non-A, non-B.
And I know I said that was my last question, but I have got one more, I'm afraid, just arising out of that. Would this be right, that your expectation would be, but by 1989, leave aside what perhaps should have been understood about the serious nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis earlier. Yeah. The inquiry's heard lots of evidence about that already, but specifically 1989, would your expectation be that ministers, by whatever route, by 1989 would understand that non-A, non-B hepatitis, now known as hepatitis C, was a serious condition that could cause long-term liver damage and indeed lead to hepatocellular cancer and be fatal?
Yes, but I think the other thing you have to recall is that at this sort of time, the ortho test and hepatitis C itself had been discovered. So I'm pretty sure that ministers would have been told about that, because one of the impressions that I got while I was at DH is that you have to make sure that a minister is not unsighted by something that he's asked in the House. So, for example, Hep C was discovered. Now, somewhere along the line, ministers have to know that Hep C is there, because some clever clogs MP would ask the minister. And then what does the minister say? So by my judgment, the minister would have been told, if only, look, minister, this is something that's been discovered recently. In case you're asked about it, this is what it is.
Sir, I note the time. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, and in any event, I've made inroads into everybody's coffee break, so perhaps we could break now.
Yes, well, we'll take a break, shall we, until 10 to 12. 10 to 12.
And sir, could you give the normal
yes, I will.
Warning to Dr. Rejman?
Dr. Rejman, you're giving evidence.
Yes.
I don't know if you've watched any of the proceedings previously for the inquiry. You may have heard me say to witnesses at the first break, or sometimes at the start, that whenever there is a break, you may talk about anything you like, but you may not talk about the evidence you have given or anything which you think you may yet be asked about.
Yes.
Anything else is fair game, but not your evidence.
Yes. Thank you.
Whoever the person is. 10 to 12.